with us, and let's penetrate the just transition and what are the pathways to transform our economies. So I will be very happy to be joined by Josh Fried from the Third Way. Josh, please welcome Josh with your applause. Thank you. My great pleasure to have Dan Poneman with me. Dan was US Secretary of Energy a couple of years ago, and we are friends and fellows at Atlantic Council. Dan, great to have you. My great pleasure also to have Georg Zachmann from Bruegel, but also Green Deal Ukraine. We're working together on this subject as well. Georg, prominent European energy economist, great to have you with us. And I'm so happy that Reka could have joined us. Reka Szemerkenyi, she's a former ambassador of Hungary to Washington, and right now one of the most active and engaged people organizing us in the Central Europe ahead of the challenges that we face. Thank you very much, Reka, for joining us. So I'm so glad that you are here, and we had an excellent already introduction, lots of discussions, and we could have seen a historical perspective for European energy transition. We could have seen Russian implication, ministerial panel, a lot of issues were discussed. Now let's move to the practicalities, whether it's feasible and where it's feasible, how to start the transition, what are the best places to tackle it. Josh.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and it's been a fascinating conversation this morning because you've heard about a couple of key components of it. One is providing technology optionality, because what is practical, both on terms of cost, in terms of energy security, and in terms of reliability for one country, may not be for another. And there needs to be the optionality so that countries that determine for heavy industry, for affordability, for security, that there is the desire, for example, for nuclear power, for the use of hydrogen, for the use of carbon capture with gas, that there is the ability to do that. The second key part is planning reform. As in the United States, Europe, the United Kingdom, we have a plague across advanced economies that it just takes far too long to build. So we talk about the need for the transition, we talk about the need for energy security, but we have not seen a willingness across any of our nations and across Europe to make the hard decisions to say that it needs to be moving quickly, and we need to adjust regulatory systems that often haven't been updated, market systems that haven't been updated for the realities of the particularly post-Russian invasion of Ukraine, but even the transition to recognize the number of factors that come into why we need to build quickly and build all of the different types of resources, including transmission, that we need to.
Thank you very much. And what do you think in this regard is missing in Europe? You mentioned optionality. What we should probably stress more?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are critical right now. One is the ability to start transforming how the markets are designed so that there can be more certainty in terms of investment, that it is able to come into what is needed where it's needed. I mean, we've talked a lot with the Polish government about their commitment, which we have seen across governments now, to modernize its energy system, both in terms of building nuclear power plants, large light water reactors, small modular reactors, renewables, and building the transmission that's needed. There is a lot of private capital that is available, but there needs to be more pathways to certainty so that they can invest in places like Poland where there is an opportunity for growth and have more confidence in the rate of return. And there needs to be a willingness, as the Draghi report laid out, to create more investment incentives and a recognition that there needs to be more of the kind of commitment to moving with the diversity of energy supply that's needed so that Europe can not just be more faster in terms of its transition to clean energy, but also recognize that there's the need for more ensuring that there's heavy industry that remains on the continent. And we haven't seen that in the previous European Parliament for understandable reasons, but it's time to start seeing that transition, as I think we've seen from von der Leyen's speech and from the Draghi report and other moves recently.
Thank you. Indeed, we have a lot of energy-intensive European industries right now being absorbed by Inflation Reduction Act subsidies in US. What would be your advice to Europeans in this regard?
Yeah, look, I think one thing that happened is the reality of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law is that, for better and worse, the United States often is a very inward-looking country when we're developing policies, and it certainly does not feel that way in Europe. I was in Brussels soon after the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law, and there were a lot of questions about the implications of it within the World Trade Organization, within how could the United States act like this with such little regard or thought for the implications for European industry. The reality is it was unfortunately simply not taken into consideration. The United States is very much looking towards China and the competition that we face with China, the security threat we face with China, and the recognition that more needed to be done to enable United States industries to compete. I think in a way that suits Europe, both similar action needs to be taken here. There needs to be a little, there's the debate that is happening on additional public investment to create a more competitive playing field with China. And I think there also needs to be much more consideration of how do we enter into more transatlantic cooperation. So critical mineral buyers clubs, more compacts around specific sectors. We've tried, I think we need to try again to have some sort of trade deal around steel and aluminum so that we can start creating the kinds of partnerships between the United States and Europe that not only help accelerate the green transition, but also take into consideration that there is a common security interest against the threat of China and Russia. There's a willingness in the United States amongst both many mainstream Republicans as well as Democrats to do this. And I think we need to see both sides coming together and thinking about it, not just within the context of green energy and climate, but also really within the urgency of security and competing with just very heavily subsidized Chinese industries.
I think you also point to a very interesting switch in the way we see energy regulation. It's not anymore only technicalities regarding a given market, but it's very deeply rooted into geopolitics of today. And thank you very much for bringing this to the table. But let me come back a little bit to nuclear. Well, Poland is a country which engaged in a nuclear project, and it's a coal country. How would you marry both, Dan?
I think it's a natural marriage and a beneficial one. We're already working hard in the United States, Michał. And let me first thank you personally for your leadership in this field and the Warsaw Security Forum for hosting this great session. We have dual imperatives. We are in a race and it's a sprint against the clock. The consequences of blowing past the 1.5 degree centigrade target of Paris, we're losing. And we're losing big, and we're losing now. And the consequences are evident every day. You don't need to read a bunch of scientific reports anymore. Therefore, for climate change reasons alone, it is imperative that we accelerate the transition away from coal. And, as you were just beginning to discuss with Josh, for national security reasons, it's important that we go to something that can be independent of an excessive dependence on countries like Russia and China. Nuclear fits the bill perfectly. We have found in the United States, apart from that little nuclear island, the nuclear steam supply system, the balance of plant, the transmission system, the workers who can support those things, translate very smoothly from nuclear to coal. There's a company well known, founded by Bill Gates, TerraPower. They're building a project in Wyoming specifically on an old coal site. The United States Department of Energy has a major initiative to convert coal sites into nuclear sites. So I think as all of us in Europe and the United States look to this dual imperative of tackling on an urgent basis our climate challenge and tackling on an urgent basis the national security vulnerabilities that we face because of excessive dependence not only on the power systems coming from China and Russia, but the fuel that can choke off our economies at moments of critical national security crisis, we really need to accelerate that transition. I personally take my hat off to Poland for having taken a large initiative, and I think because of the strong links throughout Central Europe, this can actually be a role model for countries throughout the region.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for providing us with this trajectory from coal to nuclear using the same transmission infrastructure, using a lot of existing assets already in a country like Poland, which is an industrial country. But let me be a little bit advocatus diaboli. People looking from outside the nuclear space are seeing a lots of different designs. You mentioned today TerraPower, but many people would be talking about NuScale, if we have our Romanian friends with us, GE Hitachi design, if we talk with our Orlen Synthos colleagues here, and many others. And people are a little bit lost because all these technologies, in fact, are trying to prevail and to develop arguments while the other is not good. And for the public opinion, I think what they hear is also nuclear is not good. So how would you answer this, and how do you overcome challenges linked with the fact that we have so many designs and still first of a kind we are unable somehow to make it run?
Excellent questions. I will answer them, Michał, in reverse order. Why nuclear? I cannot improve on the one-sentence definition by Bill Gates of the case for nuclear. It is the only carbon-free source of power that operates day or night in every season, almost anywhere in the world, that's been proved to operate successfully at large scale. And given the vertiginous increase in power demand everywhere, especially driven by AI, this is more important than ever. And given, you were talking about industrialization, the need to decarbonize not just power generation, but industrial processes and transportation. You know, if you fire up an EV with a coal-fired plant, you haven't really solved the problem. And some of these advanced designs, which I'll come to in a second, have high temperature steam that can be used to make plastic and other products. So the decarbonization of industrial processes, which is critical since power generation is only about a quarter of overall emissions, is imperative. Now, to this confusing kaleidoscope of designs, and I will be ecumenical and not advocate for anything here. I don't have a dog in that hunt in any event. But I think of this, Michał, as a little bit like the decade between 1900 and 1910 with automobiles. Some people might remember the Stanley Steamer. There are a whole bunch. And what we need to have is a shakedown. We have to have a shakedown in this industry. It's a historic fact. In the 1950s, most, if not all, of these so-called new advanced nuclear technologies, molten salts, liquid metal, etc., they were being developed in the 1950s. But we had a president named Dwight Eisenhower who said, we're going in this strategic direction. And we had an admiral named Hyman Rickover who said, those are all very interesting designs, but I got to get going here. So we're going to pick the one that fits on a submarine. I'm going to call it a light water reactor. And then we built 90 on submarines and over 100 in our economy. So I'm not saying we have to go down to one, but we've got to get it down to a number that people can understand and make choices, and you can't have regulatory authorities approving 100 different designs. The system will clog up and get paralyzed. So I think rather rapidly from this moment, Michał, we need to have that kind of, if you will, shakedown cruise and down select. I don't think it has to go down to 1 or 2, and I'll say why. Because there are some, like the ones that are light water-based advanced reactors, which would include GE here in Poland, which include NuScale in Romania. They have a readier supply chain and could have an earlier deployment schedule. They also may not have some of the performance characteristics of the so-called Generation 4 reactors, which would be like TerraPower or X-Energy, so which are better for decarbonizing industries. So I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we need to shake down from the dozen or so that are really in play to maybe a handful that will actually get deployed. And there are people with expertise who can help guide the decision, and ultimately it will be decided not so much purely by governments. Governments will clearly have a role, but private capital will diligence these technologies, and the ones that are most economic, and you've got to be economic, are going to prevail.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for this vision, which is not only for energy but also for industry, and which is marrying very well the optionality discussion that we started with. So let's move right now to our distinguished European panelists. How do you see the challenges ahead of our European energy system? And Georg, and what is the recipe for a successful Europe in this increasingly complex geopolitical situation?
Also from me, many thanks for the invitation and for hosting that, Michał. Maybe I paint out a different vision, a vision that says, okay, we are moving beyond coal. That is pretty clear. We are doing that in different sectors. We are moving out of carbon emissions, and that means green steel, potentially based on electricity or hydrogen, cement, maybe with CCS, and parts of the chemical industry, then also with green ammonia. Now, the question that I'm asking myself is, where is this new fuel for these technologies coming from? And a lot of those sectors have a long history in Europe in coal basins, where initially energy was plentifully and cheaply available in the Ruhr area, in Silesia, and in several other regions. And we have, in the past, when we started to reduce coal consumption in Europe, Western Europe a bit earlier, Eastern Europe a bit later, started to provide them with alternative sources of fuel. So the Germans built them nuclear power plants in the 60s and 70s. Then at some moment they stopped because it became very expensive. Then as natural gas from Russia became cheaper, they jumped to that and brought it to these regions. So we always continued to maintain the existing industrial clusters because they were so valuable and had such a high also political power. Now, if we take the vision of a European Union that will be largely based on renewables, then the challenge is that those renewable energy resources are not necessarily easy to bring to those current energy-intensive regions. Which brings us to the question of just transition that was in the title of the session. And the question is, should we essentially fight that? Should we try to subsidize hydrogen, ask you all to pay a little extra for their heating in order to subsidize hydrogen for energy-intensive industries? Should we try to run a huge nuclear program in Europe that might deliver in 15 years, but even industry is not able to tell us what it is going to cost? Or should we say that some of the industries might just move where we already have very, very cheap electricity? In Sweden, for example, where electricity prices in Europe are among the lowest because they have abandoned onshore wind capabilities and legacy nuclear power plants that they continue to run because they didn't do things that my country chose to do. Finland, Southern Europe, north of Poland, there is abundant of cheap renewable resources available, and getting some of the energy-intensive parts of the value chain there would enable Europe to stay sovereign, to stay independent of imports from other parts of the world, would strengthen the internal market, and would allow us to competitively produce the high-value products still in the old regions and clusters of economic activity. But this requires that we don't fight against the new gravitation of the new economic geography, but rather try to embrace it and support the transition.
Thank you very, very much, Georg. So, if it is renewables, so tackling better the renewable potential, how would it marry with what we said, industrial basins? Yes, what would be your solution in this regard?
So we have these value chains that are very long and where the basis product is often globally traded, like ammonia or basic reduced iron, that is the energy-intensive pre-product that we can easily transport from one place to another. And if we are able to have, and I'm kind of caricaturing, as you understand, for the sake of the panel, if we are producing such green ammonia in Spain and then transport it to Ludwigshafen and use it there to run the chemical industry, Spain would gain from it. The ammonia would be cheap. We would maintain our strategic sovereignty, and Ludwigshafen would still be able to produce high-value added chemical products. And that would essentially marry the industrial, keeping the value in Europe, leveraging the benefit of the internal market, and at the same time decarbonizing and keeping our industry alive.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Thank you for this. And Reka, let me ask you, how do you see energy security in an increasingly complex international environment?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the organizing of this panel. I could not agree more with what has been said before me, that it is such a highly important topic that I think we have to get engaged both internally in Europe and in a transatlantic framework. And I will tell you why. So one of the first things that I would like to highlight is just following up on a previous note that we heard, and I would like to second that we're really in a race against time. But that also means that what we are facing is a shift, or we have to understand that there is a shift in our stakeholder there has to be a shift in our stakeholder understanding and approach to this dilemma. Because although we do have, and companies as well as decision makers do have the traditional set of stakeholders in making their decisions, what we're facing now is exactly as you have mentioned, the frequency of the negative consequences of the climate change, as well as the intensity of these new developments. What they mean is that our real stakeholders is the society. So we do have to engage in a very serious way in a discussion on a societal level, because it is not about a particular group, but it's about our entire society, which I think is a shift in the stakeholder approach. But that brings me to a thought that I wanted to add on before as well on this Europe-US dynamics. And it is that I think the climate change understanding of the decisions towards shifting into a net zero economy, this showed a very interesting example of how Europe was kind of setting the tone in many ways to a lot of the American companies. This was a particular issue in which what we saw was that there was a political wrangling for some time between the European decision makers and American political decision makers, with all due respect for those who were understanding the importance of handling the climate change. But despite this political wrangling or debate on the two sides of the Atlantic, what we have seen from the beginning is that several of the US industries and companies were making, in fact, or implementing several decisions that related to their production that made them compatible to the European markets, without a political kind of blessing or without a political push even. So I think it's a very interesting dynamics in the Europe-US discussion that climate change provoked, or the ambition of the Europeans to shift into a net zero economy provoked in the industrial field. But what I would like to highlight is 3 short points, which I call the 3 S words that are very important for this. One is the stakeholder and the society element that I said. The second is that what we have to see is that no one company can make obviously a difference, or no one industry can make a difference. So what we have to understand this in making our decisions is that it's a systemic change that we need to kind of focus on. So what we have to try to understand behind all our ambitions, for instance, what you said to create a level playing field with China, yes, we have to think about it systemically, and that requires a Europe-US fundamental strong cooperation. And I would go beyond. That requires a Europe-US plus partners, plus allies, plus like-minded decision makers kind of involvement. So it's a systemic approach, I think, that we have to aim at exactly to be able to create a level playing field. And the last S is that I would like to highlight in this is that I think there's a dilemma, of course, about how to handle change of going from a carbon heavy to a non-carbon heavy or less zero carbon economy. And of course the dilemma is always, how do you see the change? You have a phase of transitioning into a new era. At the same time you are transitioning out of an era. And of course, for investment decisions, for de-investing in certain areas, these two seem to be totally different kind of sets of decisions. And yes, they are just different. We are transitioning out, we're transitioning in, but it's not necessarily a succession from one kind of era to another. Because what we will see, and I think primarily because of the rapid changes, is that this is almost a parallel process. We have to be transitioning out of certain industries and certain investments as much as we're transitioning into a new phase of industrial activities. And that's the kind of framework in which we are making decisions on, like I said, investments, on asset closure, on decommissioning, on divestments, and all of the kind of major decisions are part of this, because the impacts are very similar to our society and to our industry and corporate decision making. At the same time, also because they are simultaneous, the impacts are really impacting on. I mean, it's back and forth in most of the decisions that are being made. Shortly.
Thank you very much, Reka. Let me come back to geopolitics, if I may, because both you, Georg, you a little bit touched the subject also, Dan. Georg, you mentioned rather Spain and Germany in terms of cooperation rather than Germany and Louisiana, let's say. But nevertheless, the issue is on the table. I mean, we are increasingly alone as democracies and as like-minded countries. Between Europe and North America and allies. And we are facing an increasingly complex world. We have seen what happened in Lebanon this night as well. So there is a domino of events all across the globe, which is making this globe a more uncertain place. Is it a time the same way as we did after the Second World War, or maybe after the oil crisis in '73, where International Energy Agency was born? Is it a time for, let's say, a stronger partnership across the Atlantic? If yes, how it should be structured? If no, what is the alternative?
I'll take a stab at that. I think the answer is yes, and I think the obvious danger is evident to everyone in this room. I'm old enough to remember, maybe a few are, October 1973, and the shattering impact of OPEC on world oil markets. It took the United States from 1973 40-ish years to get back to the point where we're now the world's leading producer. We were lulled into a sense of false complacency by the easy, cheap fuel. And we're at risk of having this same, and now we've gotten over that, and now we have a much more democratized production, and we've had a huge surge in the U.S. And I'm reminded of what First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill said in converting the British Navy from coal to oil, that you find security through variety and variety alone. It is not going to be an answer for everybody to be self-sufficient in every energy resource, because province does not distribute geological resources evenly across the world. We're at risk of having the same problem erupt in advanced renewable energy because of the critical minerals that are distributed unevenly, and more critically, the processing thereof, which is being concentrated in places like China. And therefore, we would be foolish to make the same mistake. And I don't believe in reinventing the wheel needlessly. I believe that the invention of the International Energy Agency at that time was a good thing to do. And I have not been deeply engaged with them lately, but I would humbly submit to my colleagues to get their views on whether or not making sure that the IEA has a remit and a mandate that permits them to address the same kinds of diversification requirements and reinforcement of one another's vulnerabilities that the IEA has been so successful at implementing in the area of critical minerals. So as we do see a widespread deployment of renewables, we don't fall into the same complacency that allowed us to become subject in geostrategic leverage terms to excessive dependence on one or two countries that may not share our values and our interests.
Can I jump on this? Because I'm so glad you raised Daniel 1973. I think it's such an important moment, and I think it's very much part of the current dilemma that or problems that we had with Russia's attack on Ukraine in Europe, which was not so much seen or understood in the U.S. And it is exactly going back to 1973, when, because of the oil crisis, what happened in the US was exactly as you said, but what happened in Europe was a need for diversification, and the Soviet energy imports appeared as the means of diversification for Europe. So our ties, meaning Germany, France, Italy, ties going back to having a Russian import gas go back to 1973, Russian import oil go back to 1973, and it was a part of a diversification. So I would second absolutely what you say about variety is the only security, but I would say variety with or on the basis of like-minded countries, suppliers, and trade partners.
Yeah, and to build on both Dan and Reka's point, I think it's the combination of those two things and a recognition that we're still in many cases reliant on international organizations and processes that were born just after the Second World War and were really developed during the Cold War and an era of globalization. That era, unfortunately, appears to be over, and the entities that we had built are not purpose-built for an era of democracies competing against authoritarian states and dealing with climate change and what really has become the weaponization of energy, and looking at how we can expand on the role of IEA. There's been a proposal in the United States to create something equivalent to a clean energy Marshall Plan amongst like-minded countries around critical minerals, around financing, around building and trading more of the energy assets and innovation that Europe and the United States and countries like Japan and South Korea do so well, and also starting to figure out how we can coordinate in a coordinated fashion, export our technologies in an affordable way to the global south, because that is also where our values are competing against Russia and China. But right now, we're not thinking of that strategically, and I think it's very dangerous in the short term and incredibly risky over the longer term.
Thank you, Josh. You bring a very interesting concept, clean energy Marshall Plan. That's very, very interesting. By the way, you know that 10% of the money which went to Europe for the Marshall Plan were spent actually on buying European oil at that time. That was So Marshall Plan had already a very interesting energy dimension at that time. We would probably turn it a little bit differently now, but doesn't. Georg, how do you see it?
Yeah, maybe let me pick up this Green Energy Marshall Plan. It's so far kind of still requires some more definition and clarity. So the nice thing about it is everybody can read into it what they like, which makes these concepts initially very useful and fruitful. The way I would like to frame it, and certainly some people would disagree, is I think it's a great idea. I think it's very useful to bring down the cost of capital for clean technology exports to the global south and other parts of the world. The main problem that I see in many of these countries is a lack of functioning markets that are able to refinance corresponding investments. And what I would see as the sort of silver bullet is tools that imply some conditionality on the development of regulatory frameworks in the countries that would essentially tell those countries you get access to corresponding finance if your market is not betraying past investors for a certain period of time. And that allows not only the money directly to flow from this Marshall Plan money, but it would also de-risk all other investors coming there significantly and bring down the cost. The challenge, of course, in the end will be kind of who is going to decide on the rules of that, and will the ones that decide on the rules prefer yellow or green electrons or whatever. So there is a lot of work to be done, but I think it's a very, very fruitful avenue for discussion across the OECD. And maybe one last point, if I may, I think from a European perspective, it needs to be highlighted. I think we have one tool that has been very efficient in decarbonization in Europe, which is carbon pricing. It has been able to set a ceiling with respect to the emission allowances that are offered for until we run out of those allowances. And as such, it is really a great commitment device of the state to be true to its promises. And if there would be any chance of discussing that with a future US administration, and of course from a European perspective, that would be the best way forward to extend also the reach of not only carbon pricing, but to the two continents, but even beyond.
I come back to this. You mentioned that it would be good to fuel bus factory, if I may remember correctly, with Spaniard green hydrogen, let's say. If I push a little bit this idea of green Marshall Plan or clean energy Marshall Plan beyond the north-south divide, but rather integrating transatlantic energy market, would it be okay for Europeans if we somehow brought our green hydrogen or green ammonia from Houston and not because probably that would be cheaper. Would it make sense, and under which conditions?
In my view, it would be part of the mix in Europe. I think that Europe would want to have a certain autonomy of its own, but it would also like to see diversified competition for such imports in order to get good prices and good supply security. And the US in the energy crisis has saved us with the lucky coincidence of the ramp up of the LNG exports. We shouldn't think those things without the US.
Thank you very, very much. That was an extremely interesting discussion. And I would like to thank you, my panelists, distinguished panelists, and I would like that we thank them all with our big applause. Thank you.